is Kelly. I'm somewhat of a local. I live in Keene, so it's about 15 minutes away. And I'm an ecological designer and planner. I first got introduced to permaculture when I was actually in college by Steve Whitman, who is a permaculture teacher throughout the state of New Hampshire. He teaches at a bunch of different colleges, different community centers, different sites. And so he really showed me what the concept of permaculture was. I was really inspired by it. I was a young environmentalist. I still am a young environmentalist. But I saw permaculture as a way to really create solutions in a local grassroots way on the ground. Something that I wasn't seeing in sort of my own personal advocacy work. And I saw sort of the power that permaculture can have within communities. First in my college community, and then outward as I gained more experience in permaculture in the design process. I've learned how to apply and create designs for a bunch of different types of landscapes. And so I'm really excited to share some of this knowledge with you all today. And I want this to be interactive and for you guys to ask questions throughout, and especially because we all may be at different exposures to what permaculture is. So I guess I just want to start with who's heard of it? Who's like somewhat familiar with the concept of permaculture? Somewhat? A little bit? Who's like doesn't know anything about it? Awesome. Yeah, right? Totally. That's awesome. So we have a lot of people who know very different, or at different levels of understanding what it means. And so today, what I really want you all to get out of this is I'm going to provide you an intro to the concepts, to dive a little bit into the principles and ethics, and how they can really guide the design process to create sustainable systems. And really to inspire you to learn more about permaculture on your own. This is going to be just the touch of the iceberg. You can get pretty deep into a lot of the topics that I'm going to cover today, but hopefully this will inspire you to discover and learn and experiment with this stuff on your own as well. So you'll find that when permaculture practitioners or designers are asked to define permaculture, it's going to sound really different. There's so many different types of definitions for this concept. This is one of my favorites. Permaculture is an approach to design human settlements and agricultural systems that are modeled after patterns and relationships found in nature. It combines whole systems thinking, ethics, and design principles to create landscapes that are sustainable and productive. It's kind of a dense definition, and I'm hoping that we can kind of break it down a little bit further as we go through more of this content. So really the focus when we're creating permaculture systems, we're looking to provide human needs while maximizing ecosystem health. Generally, they're landscapes that generate food, medicine, energy, fiber, community, as well as healthy soil, water, and biodiversity. So we're looking at landscapes that both provide for humans, for us, as well as for the ecosystems that our landscapes are nested within. And there's a very unambiguous focus on environmental stewardship. That's sort of like the root and the core of everything that we do in designing and implementing permaculture systems. It's about working with rather than against nature and learning from nature's processes. And these systems tend to be small scale, intensive, and they integrate plants, buildings, animals, peoples. A lot of our systems in modern society, a lot of our landscapes are very isolated. We have commercial farms, we have schools, and I feel like in the past, 20, 30 years or so, we've been seeing a lot more integration. We see school gardens, we see prisons that are growing their own food now. So you're seeing a lot of these needs being met by multiple different types of landscapes now, which is great. And the beauty of the permaculture design process is that it can be applied to a balcony, it can be applied to your backyard, it can be applied whether you live in a city or a rural town. We can see permaculture at work in the suburbs. even in community spaces like parks, schools. And I feel like this is really where the power of this design process lies, is that it can be applied to all these different types of spaces. So I feel like I'm going to kind of briefly talk about the history of it, because I feel like it's really important in understanding what permaculture is. And so these two guys here, David Holmgren and Bill Mollison, live in Australia. And they are kind of credited with coining the term permaculture in the mid-1970s. They were two kind of radical guys who developed this concept in response to the global environmental crises. I think they were seeing a lot of the effects of that in Australia, in terms of large-scale commercial agriculture stripping the land of its resources, whether that be soil, biodiversity, etc. And they saw permaculture as a way to integrate a lot of different ways of thinking: ecology, agriculture, horticulture, architecture, all these different lenses of thinking about things. They sort of integrated a lot of that knowledge into what permaculture is. And so also during the 70s, it was kind of an interesting time, because the environmental crises that I was just mentioning, I feel like was becoming more knowledgeable to mainstream society. So Donna Meadows, who and her team of scientists wrote a book in 1971 called Limits to Growth, which was pretty monumental in the field of environmentalism. It really kind of pinpointed how our resource consumption is outpacing our population growth. How just like every other species on Earth, we're subject to the law of limits to growth, natural law, which governs every organism, all the different systems within the biosphere. And so this literature was also coming out around the same time that permaculture was kind of being originated, being formed. And she really kind of focused on getting the message that our current way of living was unsustainable, and that in order to secure an abundant future for our children, we were going to have to examine new ways of living. And the way that we have been interacting with nature as a modern society has been exploitative, it's been unjust, and these are just some examples of the patterns that you see in terms of the way our modern society has been interacting with nature. Deforestation for monoculture agriculture, for development like the one that you see on the left, which results in sprawl. Our waste cycles are extremely inefficient, and so that we have pollution in our waterways, our lands. So these are like really big issues, right? We all grapple with these really big issues. And luckily, I feel like permaculture gives us a way to positively look at the future and create solutions. Like, how do we deal with all these problems in the world? How do we address them as a species? And please feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions or anything like that throughout the presentation. So some of the kind of development patterns that I was just describing really comes from the fact that we have a lot of cheap oil available to us, and have since the Industrial Revolution, and that's kind of been pretty influential in how we've gotten to where we are today, right? And so this chart here sort of shows the different directions that we as a society could potentially go in once we start running out of oil. Because that's the thing, it's a finite resource. And so this is kind of an interesting chart, and this middle line right here sort of, it's kind of the time where you see fossil fuel depletion really starting. And so, we could crash as a society, meaning that we didn't prepare in any way whatsoever for this future. We just kind of keep going on the same path that we're going on and keep consuming this resource pretty heavily. And it's not going to look so good if we don't prepare other energy systems, if we don't prepare for that future. There's sort of the techno-fantasy or green tech stability route, which there's a lot of technological and economic optimists new like industrial biological revolution, and like it's the golden age. It's like the golden age of technology where it's going to kind of solve a lot of our problems, and we'll just keep inventing new technology to address these depleting resources, right? And then there's the creative descent, which I sort of feel like permaculture falls under. And that really focuses on earth stewardship as a way to move into this uncertain energy future that we have. And I feel like it's really about creatively using our existing wealth to rebuild natural capital. And so that's why within permaculture, it's really about reducing our ecological footprint, honestly. Like, if we all work towards reducing our ecological footprint together, I guess, have you ever heard the phrase, the whole's more than the sum of its parts?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. I feel like it's very similar to that. If we all try to do our part in some way, and that's going to look really different, the way that we apply permaculture to our own lives is going to look really different from each other. But that's going to contribute to something much larger than each of us individually. So the ethics are the foundation of permaculture. Any design you create, any plan or project you engage in within your property, within any type of landscape that you're working with, these three ethics are at the core. Every system is going to look very different from each other, but all of them are going to be created with these ethics in mind. And so earth care refers to preserving ecosystems and everything that resides within an ecosystem: animals, plants, soil, water. People care refers to ourselves, our neighbors, our communities. And the way I like to think about people care is that sort of about empowering ourselves to make the changes within our own lives that we know we can do. We're really creative people. as humans, we're really creative. And to inspire others, our community members, to help us on that journey. And to take personal responsibility. I think personal responsibility is a really huge part of that ethic as well. And then fair share sort of refers to putting limits on consumption and sharing the wealth, sharing the abundance. And I have like some little cherry tomatoes, it's crazy, right? But I go and I give them to my neighbor. My neighbor actually, who's here, who's also a permaculturist, will trade food. It's great. So he grows mushrooms, and we have a lot of salad greens, and so we give him that. So you don't have to like grow everything on your own. You don't have to do this all by yourself. If we're all kind of doing a little bit, we can kind of help each other out. And so David Holmgren and Bill Moss, and the two guys that I showed earlier, developed these 12 principles which sort of surround the three ethics. And really these are considered as tools to use throughout the design process. And they allow us to create thoughtful designs for small-scale intensive systems which are labor efficient and use biological resources over fossil fuels. And so what I'm going to do here is go through some of the principles and give examples and photos and pictures, and I might pose some questions to you all. I'm sure this is the thing, is that people tend to be experimenting with permaculture on their own without even knowing it. I find that all the time, and even with myself I found that. I'm like, I guess I was already thinking that way when I put my compost over here because it's so close to my kitchen. Like, there was some logic behind that. So we're just going to go through some of the principles, and I'll show you examples of how you can use them within your own backyards or your own landscapes. And the beauty of these is that there's so many examples for all of these different principles. I'm just kind of showing one or two for each one. So if you do have another example that you think the group would find useful hearing, please say it. So the first principle is observe and interact. And so Bill Mollison kind of always said, don't touch or modify or manipulate a landscape until you've observed it for a year. And so I understand that sometimes, depending on our living situation, depending where we live or our time spans, whatever, we may not always have a full year to observe a landscape and to observe the changing seasons and just the different patterns that are happening in that space. But I think really what he meant is that if you are sitting and taking the time to watch what's happening and to absorb, and you're saying, okay, there's water pooling in that corner of my yard. If you just make note of that in a very non-judgmental way, that can be used to create a more efficient design later on for your yard. Maybe that dip that has all that water can become a rain garden, and it can actually be a space where plants can grow. Water can be taken from your driveway, pollutants are filtered out, so you're actually cleaning water. So maybe that space that seemed to be kind of just like a dead zone, like it's like a space in my yard that's just like an eyesore, it's like not doing anything, it's just sitting there. It can become something that's providing for you, it's providing for nature. So observing and interacting, I feel like, is one of the most important principles to practice within your landscape. Whether you have a journal, there's a lot of different tools nowadays in terms of understanding the sun and shade patterns on your site. There's a lot of different types of tools that you can use to do this effectively. And I'll give my contact information out to people as well at the end of the presentation, and hopefully if you do have questions of like, what are some of those tools, right? Like, what are some of those? You can email me, and I can tell you what's worked for me, and give you some other contact information for other people as well. So the second principle is cache and store energy. So there's a lot of different types of energy sources out there. We can kind of interpret this in a lot of different ways. This example is showing capturing and storing the energy of the sun, the mother source. And so this example on the right shows a PV system being installed, and the example on the left shows a greenhouse which is using the sun to both extend the growing season, to create healthy food crops. And so that's the thing. We can think about these types of energies in different ways that we can use it and store it to provide for us, for electricity, for water, for food. And if we start thinking about this type of energy as valuable as natural capital, that's going to really improve the resiliency of our systems. Obtaining a yield is like one of my favorites, I think. It's such a happy principle, you know? It's sort of, I feel like it's all about, no matter what design you're creating, no matter what space you're trying to design, to always incorporate yields within it. You want it to provide for you. Like, if you're going to spend time working and developing gardens, for example, you want to get food out of it, right? You want to get medicine, fiber, beauty, and you want to be able to share the wealth. That's really important. So applying self-regulation and feedback, this is probably one of the more kind of vaguer ones. And so I kind of like to think of it as an example of the forest. So the forest is kind of this like model self-regulating ecosystem. A lot of the needs are being provided by various elements within this ecosystem. You have trees that are using sunlight to provide food for themselves and grow. You have leaf litter that's falling onto the forest floor. It's decomposing with the help of fungi. And it's turning into healthy soil, which then encourages more plants to grow. And so you have all of these different closed-loop systems that are happening within a forest ecosystem. And if we sort of start thinking about designing our own landscapes like forests, that could mean that we might not have to put as much work into it. If the forest is doing most of the work, if the landscape is doing more of the work, then that means we don't have to do as much of the work. So that's sort of thinking of like taking these self-regulating systems and using them as models to create our own systems, such as this is an edible forest garden. So these are sort of the food forest layers. This is a technique, a permaculture technique that you can use for your own gardens. And there's going to be plenty of workshops later that really delve into this topic a lot further. So this is sort of just, brushing the tip here. But a well-designed forest garden can be essentially a self-regulating or self-maintaining system by employing strategies like planting ground covers and mulching heavily to reduce weeds. Then you don't have to go out and weed as much. Incorporating nitrogen fixtures to replace fertilizers. So not only is it saving energy for you, but it's also saving external energy that it took to make those fertilizers that you have to purchase to put on your garden. So we can actually use plants to do that for us. By incorporating self-seeding plants and perennials, I love that because it takes a lot of time at the beginning of the garden season to plant new plants every year for your annual, right? Like annuals are really intensive and they take a lot of work. So if we can at least even designate part of our yard, for example, to having perennial plants growing, to having self-seeding annuals like chamomile or plants like that, then we don't have to put as much work into it. And sort of the other part of this principle is feedback and accepting feedback. So I like to sort of think of that as like what is and isn't working. Like, I have a house and I have a yard and I'm living there for like years and years and years, right? And so the system is changing over time. My garden is always changing. And so if you're asking yourself like very regularly, what's working? Like, is this actually working? Am I producing like a lot of waste here? Am I like putting way too much energy, more than I want to, in this part of my yard, for example? That can really help. And if you accept that feedback and change your own behavior, change that overall system, that can really help you in the future. I recognize in myself sometimes you like get in these habitual patterns where like you just start doing things a certain way and you like don't even realize like that it might be inefficient until you actually unconsciously look. You're like, wait, why am I like walking all the way over there to dump this material? Why? I can use it somewhere else. Like, why do I keep doing that? So it's like permaculture is a very self-reflective process. And you can also look at feedback. So feedback and self-regulation can be looked at in a lot of different ways. And I'm going to hand out a sheet at the end that I made of resources. And there's a lot of books in there that kind of delve into that principle a little bit further. But for sake of time, we're going to go to the next one. So using and valuing renewable resources and services is kind of self-explanatory. Like we talked about the sun before. And this is inherent in any type of permaculture project you see. This is an example right here of a Google culture bed. And so this is using biomass, which is a renewable resource, to create a no-till raised garden bed. Has anyone heard of Google culture beds before? Has anyone built one? They're cool, right? Google culture? Yes, I know, it's kind of a crazy word. Google culture. I think it means hill mound. Yeah, sophisticated, right? It's German, yeah. So Sepp Holzer is, I don't know if he invented the bed, but he's done a lot of work with Google culture beds. And I actually think that his book is on the resource list that I printed out. So if you want to learn more about this type of garden bed, you can totally do so in that book.
There's one at Cheshire Fairgrounds if you want to go see one in action, right near the fence.
Do you know how long it's been? It's been 4,
maybe 5 years, so it is starting to break down.
Yeah.
They're growing food for the community kitchen there, so I get to harvest off of it.
Awesome. Are you the cleaning coordinator? Awesome. I've been meaning to connect with you at some point. That's great. I saw your picture of paper. So what she's referring to in terms of the breaking down of material is that Google culture beds are built by stacking biomass, so that can be small logs, trees, limbs, sticks, like compost, soil, leaf litter, any other type of mulch, straw, pretty much whatever materials that you're able, whatever organic materials that you're able to, that are accessible to you. And then you put soil on top of that, or compost in particular, and you're able to plant the plants directly at the top. And so, sort of, over time, the decaying of these different kind of biomaterials contributes to soil fertility. Apparently, too, like as the materials start breaking down, supposedly the aeration is increased, which like kind of is supposed to, that's why it's no-till. That's why it's able to work as a no-till method. So yeah, this is kind of a really interesting way to use a renewable resource in your land like in reality, might not be using it for the most efficient way, most effective way. And so why not be able to use it to grow our own food? Makes a lot of sense. So producing no waste, actually, okay, I feel like I can probably say each of the principles are like my favorite for their own way. This is another one of my favorites. Producing no waste is kind of self-explanatory. I feel like if we kind of go into designing a plot with this principle at the forefront of our vision, we can get really creative. I feel like this is like the principle where like you can get like the most creative in creating closed loop systems. Bill Mollison always said the problem is the solution. And I feel like it really applies to this particular principle. What is waste to one thing can actually be of use to another. So a really good example is our old kitchen scraps. This is kind of the obvious example. Can go into a compost pile and then can become a resource for our gardens. And so another sort of part of this principle is really looking at the inputs and outputs of a system and how we can design that to our advantage. So the picture's a little blurry, but I really like this example. This is from an English permaculture garden. This is in England, but it's inside a greenhouse. And what this guy did was he put a huge pile of compost in the corner of his greenhouse, lined the sides of it with just like old plywood, put a pallet on top. And what happened was that because it was a greenhouse, the temperature of the compost was increasing. It was getting a lot warmer, and so he used it as like a way to grow tender seedlings. It was like a heating mat, which is great. And I bought heating mats before. They're like expensive, right? And they rely on electricity. So this is just like an innovative way to think about like, okay, like we have a lot of compost, and a lot of times farms have a lot of compost, like a lot that's just sitting there. And so this is a way that we can think about using waste as something to provide for kind of another subsystem. So designing from patterns to details. So nature's patterns are kind of a source of inspiration for permaculture designs. An example of this is seen, in nature, branching patterns tend to collect and distribute materials and energy. That's kind of like what they do. You can see them in river networks. You can see them in the roots and branches of trees, which are kind of collecting and distributing light. They're doing that with water, nutrients, etc. And so that's why a lot of times in permaculture gardens you'll see branching patterns, because you're taking materials and you're distributing them throughout the site, whether that be mulch or compost, things like that. So there's not only like a beauty part of like nature's patterns that is really wonderful to incorporate in our gardens, but there's like a utilitarian purpose to a lot of them. What other patterns can people think of? It's okay, you can't think of that many. I figured I'd pose it out there. Can anyone think of any other patterns that they see in nature?
Spirals.
Spirals, yeah. You see those all the time, whether it be like in the center of a flower, a shell. Yeah.
Terraces.
Yeah, exactly. That's another good one. Cool. So integrating rather than segregating is kind of another principle that's sort of at the heart of a lot of this work. So a lot of times, even like my front yard, I'm imagining, like permaculture systems tend, from the outer eye, they can tend to look a little crazy, right? A little chaotic. And they don't all have to look like that. That's what I want to stress too, is that like, if you like to have things orderly, that does not mean that this isn't for you. You know what I mean? Like, you can apply this thinking and create a more orderly garden if that's like what you so wish. It can still be productive and it can still provide for ecosystems. But a lot of times it can look a little chaotic. And go ahead.
Excuse me, so this looks like the Native Americans' Three Sisters garden.
Yes. So, and the reason why they look kind of chaotic is because they'll usually incorporate interplanting techniques or polyculture type techniques, where you're actually planting different types of plants to mutually benefit each other, to create symbiotic relationships. And so this is sort of the classic example of the Three Sisters field. So the corn is not just, the corn, which is one element, is not just providing food, but it's also providing vertical growing space for pole beans to grow up, right? So there's multiple functions of that one element of the design. Beans are not just providing food, they're also nitrogen fixers. So they're contributing to the health of the soil, they're enabling more nutrients to be available for the heavy feeding corn and the squash. And the squash serves almost as the ground cover, it's suppressing weeds. So there's kind of mutual, there's relationships forming when you kind of see your landscape this way. Like, how can I take different plants, put them together so that they actually help each other? And so just like each element providing many functions, each function is supported by many elements. And so this can be seen, so watering our gardens is like a heavy, I feel like that's like the main thing I'm doing in the summer with my garden. I'm watering it all the time, especially this summer. And so if we're able to think about incorporating many different ways for our gardens to get water, for example, then that increases the resiliency of our systems. So for example, in this, we have a rainwater barrel, which is taking water from the roof and collecting it for use in our gardens. You'll be able to water your gardens with that rainwater. Say you also have incorporated another system as well. You have a drip feed irrigation line as well. And then maybe some of your garden beds that are a little further from the house also are planted on the backside of swales. And so swales is another permaculture technique that are usually used on hill slopes. And so a swale is a very shallow depression, and when you dig that shallow depression, you can take the soil and mound it on the other side. Maybe add compost, mulch, etc., and plant into it. And so the water running down that hill slope will collect into the shallow depression and slowly seep in, especially if you add a lot of mulch, it will kind of slowly seep in, and that mulch will keep it moist, hold that moisture in, which could reduce the amount of watering you need to do for your garden. So if we have all these different watering methods, maybe our drought period won't hurt our gardens as much. Maybe we won't lose all our crops, because this is such a good example for the summer, right? Like, I'm sure everyone's gardens are super stressed. But if you have the more systems you have in place to get water to your plants, the better off that garden will be. Cool. And I can't really talk about integrating rather than segregating without talking about integrating people. So permaculture projects tend to be really collaborative, right? Usually they involve all these different disciplines, like I was mentioning before, ecology, soil science, architecture, community development, all these different disciplines, and everyone can bring something to the table to those projects. That's why you'll see, in New Hampshire in particular, there's been quite a few community design treks where permaculture practitioners will organize groups of people, whether that be folks who have a lot of experience in permaculture design, or maybe just took an intro course. They'll get them together into a room and pretty much they'll collaboratively create a design for a specific landscape. And so I know that there's been one done at a former mill site for kind of re-envisioning ways to use a former mill site. And so these collaborative ways are really a way for people to both gain experience in creating ecological design systems, as well as take ownership over a really cool project, something that might benefit their own community, which can really help the sustainability of the project itself. So using small and slow solutions, I remember when I first started learning about permaculture, it was okay, Liz, let's try to grow all of our own food, right now. I feel there's this, when you're really excited and passionate about stuff, you want to dive right into it. And there's something really cool about that, but at the same time, I love this principle because it reminds us that we don't need to know everything right away. Our landscapes are not going to look like edible forest gardens in a year. And to be patient with that process is it'll make it so much more worthwhile and enjoyable. And so I put this picture up here because, like, it's okay to start with one raised bed. You know what I mean? Like, just like, you know, FYI. And so using and valuing diversity, including a wide variety of plants, animals, approaches, and people into your design. Diversity is kind of like the joy of life, I feel like, right? Like having all these different people, all these different animals, all these different plants and experiences, and it makes life so great. And not only that, but including diversity in our permaculture systems, it's kind of like, I've read this recently, it's like an insurance policy. So like, say for example, I grow one type of potato plant, and then it gets ravaged by potato beetles, right? Maybe for some reason, like another variety, like doesn't get hit as bad. If we're incorporating more than one variety of plant, for example, it's like an insurance policy. We're making sure that we're covering our bases. So this one is using edges and value the marginal. So ecotones are pretty much the same thing as edges. They kind of refer to the space where two different types of ecosystems meet. So there's this space where, say, you have a lake habitat and a marshland habitat. There's this space in between that's actually more diverse than either of the two ecosystems that it's adjacent to. Because usually it includes plants from both ecosystems. And it tends to include other plants that are also just more adaptable. Like they can survive in a wide variety of conditions. And so if we actually use and design forward edges in our gardens, those can technically be some of the more diverse and productive spaces in our garden. And so example of that could be if you have a pond. That edge of your pond can be a really valuable space for growing water-tolerant, food-producing perennials, for example. Even if you have, say, a backyard that's mostly lawn, but it abuts a wooded area, that's pretty common in New Hampshire for someone's property. How can you utilize that edge space? A lot of times, in terms of gardens, they're like totally isolated from the edge. You know, it's like you have your annual garden, and then you have like the woods over here. But like, how can we kind of explore that space a little bit? How can we utilize plants that like to grow on edges, whether it be like blackberries and raspberries, things like that, that actually thrive on the edges of ecosystems? How can we utilize those in our landscapes? So this is the 12th principle, and I feel like probably like one of the most important, and like, yeah, it's one of the most important ones. Creatively using and responding to change. And just planning and designing for change in general. So just like we're changing all the time, like our lifestyles, you know, so are our landscapes. And our landscapes are going to be changing with us as well. So like, for example, the way that my property is going to look right now as a single 24-year-old, no kids, is going to be really, really different than when I'm 40 and I have a couple kids and maybe I'm working more hours. I mean, so like the time that I'm going to have to contribute to my garden, what I'm going to be growing, what my landscape looks like as a whole is going to look really different as that time kind of goes by. And so to sort of, in the permaculture design process, you're kind of thinking ahead. You're thinking about what is going to work for you in the next few years or so. And so this is a really good example of sort of forest succession. So if you do have an edible forest garden on your property, what that's going to look like, that system is not going to look the same as when you plant it. If you're really modeling it after a natural ecosystem, you're going to kind of want to invite it to evolve and change. A really good example, I feel like, of that is you see a lot of suburban yards in New England that have just like the one really big shade tree in the front yard. You know, that like one big shade tree, right? And so, say like a storm blows it down, right? The yard looks drastically different, like drastically. And in terms of like resources and materials that are happening on the site, really different. Like the sun, the availability of the sun's energy to that site like increases tenfold. So instead of just looking at, you know, so this tree gets knocked down and that's like a major change, instead of sort of being like, oh, that's a bummer. To sort of look at it as more like an opportunity. Oh, so like we can create something different now in this space. Like nature has kind of like the way it looks now and the way that it is now can provide us that something that it couldn't before. So that's the end of this PowerPoint, but I think we have like, maybe we have a couple minutes left, probably. I think so.
Yeah.
You do, okay, yeah. So if anyone wants to ask any questions, I'm going to pass out. So I made this, so it kind of has a sheet and it has some stuff about permaculture on there, as well as on the back it has some of my favorite resources, largely books, but some of them actually might be here. You might be able to buy some of these, which is great. But they're super, super useful in exploring permaculture more. Obviously, I just covered like such a small portion of what it really is. So another thing I wanted to say too is that there's a lot of permaculture design courses, full courses that are offered in New Hampshire, where you can delve into these topics and design techniques and get more practice with it. They're offered in pretty much all the regions of New Hampshire. So if you want more information about a permaculture course that's offered near you, please contact me. So my name is Liz Kelly, and I'll just give you my email, and it's lkelly@swrpc.org. It's just a lot shorter. Sorry. lkelly@swrpc.org. You got it. You got it, yeah. Totally. So I'll just pass this around, and I don't really know if there's enough. There's like 20, but if you don't want one, you don't have to take one. But if you do, feel free to.
Liz, can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
I own the community for a fairly large community garden in Middle Lebanon.
Okay.
I'm trying to figure out how what you're speaking about would apply to a community garden where you have 30 some odd beds, individually raised beds.
That's a great question. I feel like it takes a lot more coordination. There's more people involved, for sure. But it can be a really fun process in that way. And in terms of the more like landscape type techniques that you can use, I think you can definitely still experiment with like polyculture design and intercropping within raised beds for sure. A lot of community gardens too have explored with creating kind of a perennial garden bed section that is almost communal. So like it could have raspberries and blueberries and things like that, but it's maintained and kind of it can be picked and used by everyone in the garden. So that's sort of another way of community gardens using perennials. Does anyone else have any other examples of that, like community gardens and permaculture in particular?
I just know from the market in front that they've done exactly what you're saying, and so at least around the perimeter,
cool.
Creating some pollinator corners and things like that.
That's great.
So it's a nice, easy step where you don't have to mess with people's own growing styles.
Awesome. Cool.
Yeah.
Sweet. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you.
Yeah.